Hey, this is Cam with Blacktail Studio, and this week we're going to be taking you through how to make an epoxy and wood table. And you may have seen some of my other videos where I've taken you through this process before, and every one of these tables I learned a little bit more than I did on the table before. So I kind of feel like the people that watched my first video might be a little bit shorted compared to the ones that watched my last video. And this week we're going to be really focusing on the epoxy. I'm using an all-new epoxy, at least an all-new epoxy to me. And I'm going to tell you at the end what I thought of it and if it might be the best epoxy I've used yet. Stay tuned. Anyway, back to the build. As you can see there, started off a little bit rough, knocking it over. You get to see what my neighbors see all the time is me knocking stuff over and seeing if anybody saw. But I'm going through the usual steps that I've taken on my past tables, and that is just removing all the softwood. I'm going to get every bit of softwood out of there, and then I'm also going to get all the bark and really the strands, the things that kind of cling onto the side. I'm going to take everything off with this chisel to get the bulk of it, and then I'm going to switch over to a wire wheel on my angle grinder. And this works really well. It does leave a few marks, so I'm going to be doing black epoxy as you saw at the start there, so you won't see those marks. But if you're doing a clear epoxy, I might go a little less aggressive than this wire wheel on the angle grinder. A lot of people have asked if you could leave the bark on for one of these epoxy tables, and if you want a firm answer, I'd say no. Not to say that there's not somebody out there that could have done it. I've heard some bad stories of people trying it. I have never personally tried it. It doesn't seem like a very good idea to get a good solid bond, so I'd say no, but you're welcome to prove me wrong. This template is one of my favorite tools for making one of these epoxy tables because it really helps you visualize. If you're really good with Fusion 360, you may be able to get away with not using this template, but for me, I'm kind of simple and it works really well for me. And if you paid close attention, you noticed I made two marks. I made an inside mark and an outside mark, and the inside mark is going to be the finished size of my table, and the outside mark was about a 1-inch buffer on all sides. So I put the track kind of in the middle of that because I wanted to have at least a 1-inch buffer on the length and the width to make sure that when I cut it down to my final size, I got it to the exact size my client is expecting. I always give my clients the option of either me designing the table or they can kind of co-design it with me, and pretty much 100% of them take me up on the opportunity to design it with me. And I think it's great because, one, I think two minds is better than one, and two is they get exactly what they're expecting. There's no surprises in the end, and you can actually see right there on the right, I broke a piece off and brought it down at my client's request, which I would have never done on my own, but in the end it actually really improved the design of the table. This here is not the new epoxy I was talking about at the start of the video. This is a West System epoxy. It's a really good epoxy. It's really hard. It's just not a deep pour epoxy. And what I'm doing here is I'm sealing all the edges. And this is going to do a couple things. One, it's going to really prevent any bubbles from clinging to the sides. And two, it's going to prevent any staining. And it's kind of the same thing that the shellac does, is we're just providing a barrier between the black epoxy we're going to pour and the wood itself, because that black epoxy will essentially just soak into the wood and stain anything. So the shellac is going to provide that barrier on the top and the epoxy on the sides. But we have to go back and scuff it up like I'm doing here because epoxy doesn't like to stick to anything slick. And that's why we're just basically roughing it up so we get a good bond when we pour that main portion of our epoxy. If you want some more info on how I build my molds for these epoxy tables, I'll add a link to a video from a previous build in the video description where I go into a little bit more in depth. But what I'm doing here is I'm adding mold release, and that's why I covered up my pieces with that drop cloth to make sure none of that mold release settled on the wood, because that would definitely compromise the bond between the wood and the epoxy if any of that mold release settled on it. And this is something I haven't done in most of my previous builds. Is you saw I added a little bit of an air gap, and that's going to provide airflow, which is going to keep the epoxy cooler, which means I can pour more epoxy. And that's one of the big problems when making these tables is the epoxy overheating when you pour, over that 1 3/4, 2 inches. And this is going to be about 2 1/4 inches. So I wanted to make sure I definitely keep it cool enough for this kind of new experimental epoxy that I'm using. And speaking of that epoxy, the epoxy I'm going to be using for this build is the liquid glass epoxy by Fiberglass Coatings. And these guys have been around a long time. I just haven't used them before. They claim this epoxy can go 2 to 6 inches privately. I'm highly skeptical of that, but we are going to at least test it out at this 2 1/4 inch pour that we're going to do here. I actually did an entire video and blog post just on calculating epoxy, so I'll include links to both those in the video description below. Back to the epoxy, we are using the liquid glass epoxy by Fiberglass Coatings. And again, this is the 2-inch pour. Privately, they said 2 to 6 inches, which is pretty cool if it's possible. I'm not so sure it is, but they say that they've done 6-inch pours in their lab. One complaint I have is pretty small containers for these types of big pours, because I don't like having this much trash, and I end up using quite a bit of these jugs. So I will plead to them to start making bigger containers if they're going to be kind of players in this epoxy table market, because nobody likes to have this much trash. The dye I'm using is going to be this black Transtant, and you can see it works really well because you can't even read the label anymore. But what I am doing is I like to count my drops, and black, it's not as important, but if you have to go back and touch it up, it's nice to know the ratio of black to epoxy used, so that way you can get the same tone, because you will see kind of seams between pores if you have to touch up a small area. One tip I'd really give to people trying their first table is I can't emphasize how much you need to mix this epoxy. And it's not just length of time, but really scraping the sides, scraping the bottom, making sure you have every bit of it mixed way, way more than you think. Definitely overkill on the mixing. Another good tip is just letting your bucket set for about 15 or 20 minutes, and this will let a lot of those bubbles rise. You can kind of come back, pop them with the torch, and that will eliminate quite a few of your bubbles in your finished product. If this is your first time to my page, welcome. I really appreciate you watching. And one thing you should know is that I'm really good about answering almost every single one of the comments you leave down below. So if I'm not clear about anything, if I rush anything, or if you're just not sure, please feel free to ask me in the comments below. Also, I really appreciate it if you do like what you see to go ahead and hit that subscribe button up in the corner. It really helps me to keep making more content like this. And for those of you that have been to my page before, you're probably wondering how I got these amazing Michael Bay-esque aerial views when I'm normally on a static tripod. And that is because my wife wasn't at work for once, and I was able to get her to come slum it out in the garage with me and get some awesome shots, which actually worked out pretty well because she has an awesome steady hand. Although I did give her one job, and that was to keep her car out of the shot, so it didn't look like Blacktail Garage, it looked like Blacktail Studios. So she dropped the ball there, but overall she does a pretty awesome job. If you're wondering if I could tell the difference between the new epoxy and the old epoxies I've used yet, really no, I can't tell any difference. They're about the same viscosity, which really fluctuates with the temperature of your shop, so no big changes yet. It's pouring really nice. I like my usual Transtant dyes, gave it a really nice black. I'm using my usual Jello injectors to kind of fill in all these little pits and low spots. So overall, no impressions one way or the other on the epoxy so far. One thing I didn't really talk about at the start, but you need to make sure you have good kiln-dried wood. And the kiln-dried is really to make sure that you don't have any bugs that are come crawling out of a finished project, because even if you encapsulate the whole thing in epoxy, if there's live bugs inside, they will come crawling out. And you can see here, these are some little bug holes. And I buy all my wood up at Gobi Walnut, so I know everything is kiln-dried and going to be treated for it. So I'm just filling all these little bug holes with more epoxy, which actually gives a really cool look in the end, at least in my opinion. But this would be a real red flag if you had just air dried your wood. So make sure you get good kiln-dried wood if you're going to do one of these types of tables. There's one tip I can give you that's going to save you a ton of time later, and that is to brush your sides with your epoxy. And this is really going to prevent the bubbles from clinging to the sides. If you watched one of my first epoxy videos, you noticed how much time I spent filling in these tiny little pits, which are the micro bubbles right near the edges. If you brush your sides, that will really save you a ton of time later by preventing those micro bubbles from clinging. As I mentioned before, this is about 2¼ inches, maybe just over even in a few spots. And after about 14 hours, see it's up to about 95 degrees, which is a good temperature. You want it to be warm, but you don't want it to get over that, say, 120 degrees. And I am loosening these clamps because when the epoxy cures, it shrinks a little. So you don't want to prevent the wood from moving with it, which could actually crack your table. So just kind of snugged them down, and you can see there at 20 hours, it's getting really thick. Everything is curing really nicely. So I'm really liking what I see out of this epoxy so far. This liquid glass has the same cure time as the other main manufacturers, about 72 hours, although I found that's not always too consistent, but in this case, at 72 hours, it was rock hard and ready to come out of the mold. And you may remember I used mold release, and that's actually not what's sticking. It's the caulk I used around the edges of the mold that cause all the sticking, which is why I need these wood wedges, which is kind of a pain. But you can see there, once I break it free, there's absolutely nothing on the underside of the table, and that's where the mold release comes in, because if I hadn't used mold release, that entire piece of melamine would have been bonded to that epoxy there. For those of you that have seen my videos before, you've seen me go up to Creative Woodworking in Portland before, and it's just a big industrial shop. You might want to actually do some research. Your town might have someone with a big planer that'll rent out time. They charge $75 for a half hour, and I can get this done in about 8 minutes. So it's definitely worth it, much better than using a router sled or something like that. If you don't have access to a big shop, I actually have a blog where I have a few different methods of how to flatten tables like this in your garage using something pretty simple. So I'm fortunate enough to have a big shop that'll square it up on their sliding saw, flatten it on their big planer. If you're not, it doesn't mean you can't build a table. It just means that I'm a little bit luckier than you. I would like to hear from you guys in the comments if this still counts as, say, a DIY table, if I'm able to go to a big shop like this, have them do a lot of the heavy lifting. So let me know in the comments what you think, if this still counts making the table myself or if it's kind of cheating. A few months back, I went ahead and started a blog, and before I did, I wasn't really sure if there was going to be a need for it, if people were actually going to use it, and now that I have it, I'm really glad that I do, because I can dive really deep into some things that are kind of boring to some people, but are really useful to others, like things like these sanding, things like the finishing process, whereas I can get really in depth and not have to worry about making a really exciting YouTube video that is going to generate a lot of clicks. So I'll include links to both those. I have a sanding one, I have a finishing one, in addition to a lot more, and it'll really help you. You can kind of keep it as a bookmark or a reference if you have questions during your sanding and finishing process. One of the most useful products I've found in the last few months is this black CA glue, the black Star Bond, and it works really, really well, especially since I do so many black tables. These tiny little micro bubbles, you saw that I brushed it in before, but I didn't get all of them. And this one, I use a really fine, cheap paintbrush from Amazon, and I just go back and I just brush in all these little spots, and I spend quite a bit of time doing this still, even though I have my trick that's supposed to keep you from having to do this, is going back and hitting it with the little paintbrush, and the CA glue will save you a ton of time and leaves almost perfect results. After I got done rounding over the corners with this 1/8" router bit, I was going to do a few more touch-ups, and then I was going to be ready for the Osmo 1101 thin. And that's what you see here, is just a really thin finish that soaks in. It's supposed to help a lot more with the water prevention. This is a relatively new product to me, but look what I found. I found it's not really a soft spot, it's really just a porous spot. And if you saw my last table build, I ran into a similar problem. It was a little different than this, but I swore that I wasn't going to do it on this table, and sure enough, I found a problem spot. So I had to sand it down and come up with a solution to kind of harden up that area. And the solution I came up with was going to be adding this really thin CA glue, and it's similar to that black CA glue I was using earlier, but it's just really, really thin. So it's going to soak in, stabilize that kind of porous wood, come back, finish it again, and hopefully everything will work this time. But I was pretty annoyed with myself for allowing that to happen, since my last table had almost the exact same thing. So we'll go ahead and add finish and see how we did. And this is the Osmo 3043. And as I added before, I do have a full YouTube video and blog post on adding this finish, on how to get really a perfect finish, even in a dusty shop, which can be a real challenge for most of us small shop woodworkers. I get a lot of questions about what buffer I'm using, and this is a Gem Industries buffer. It's kind of a repurposed floor sander, I think it is, and it can actually be used for sanding wood too. I just find it is a little bit big for most sanding. But what I'm doing here is going back with 600 grit after it cured a day later, adding another coat. And when you are doing that sanding, you really need to make sure you get just a really perfectly even sanding. Any blotches are really going to show up. So go back, do another coat with this 3043, buff it off, do it a third time. That's what I did there, sanded it a third time with the 600 grit, and doing one final coat with the 3043. And I know this is a little bit rushed, so I do recommend you watch my other YouTube video on this finishing process before you dive in and try it yourself. The good news is the tactic we did to fix that kind of soft or porous spot, whatever you want to call it, it worked. Finish looks absolutely perfect. I just couldn't have been more happy with it. You can see here how much sheen you actually can get off of this Hardwax type of finish. So really cool finish process. Highly recommend trying it yourself. Overall, the CA trick worked, and now I'm ready to move on to the base. I had a local fabricator named Bryson Steele custom fabricated me this base, and he did an amazing job. And he's done several bases for me before, so I knew he would. And I also knew his measurements would be exactly right. And this base was done before my top was, so that's why I had to make sure my top was exactly the right size, because I knew his base is going to be the right size. And if I didn't cut the top just right, it definitely wasn't going to look right, since this is one of those bases that comes all the way out to the very edge. And now I'm going ahead and adding in these threaded inserts. And the most important thing when you're doing these threaded inserts is making sure you're using the right drill bit size. And I will say, when you're doing them in epoxy though, which I hate adding threaded inserts in epoxy, I'm just so afraid of it cracking the epoxy. I did use a slightly oversized bit for that, and then added a little bit extra of epoxy. You can see kind of it souping in there. But normally you want to make sure you use the exact right size bit for your threaded inserts. Otherwise the wood can kind of split out. At least I have a tendency to go a little bit small in my holes, and so if you use the right, correct, slightly larger drill bit size, they will go in so much easier and no tear out, and you can see just they snug up really nice. So make sure you use the right drill bit size for your threaded insert. It's kind of the theme of this part of the video. The space will be going to powder coat as soon as I'm done here, so that I'm doing one final test fit where I insert every bolt, make sure everything fits just right, so I know everything will fit just perfect when it comes back from powder coat. If you've been paying attention, you might know what I'm about to say, and that is that I actually have a full video on my photography method. So I will add a link to that in the video description, along with links to everything I've used in the video, like this photography backdrop. We went through a ton of colors trying to get the perfect copper for this base. And I will say the iPhone video, it looks really orangish. In person, it looks amazing. So the photos I took looked great, but don't kind of go by what you see here on the video. I'll show some photos at the end, but it does look much better in person than it does here on video. You're probably wondering what I thought of the liquid glass epoxy by now, and I will say that I absolutely loved it. And I should also give a disclaimer, they did send me the epoxy for free. They didn't give me any money to make the video, and I told them up front that I was going to report good or bad on what I thought of the epoxy. But no, I thought it was incredible. I've had problems with Eco Epoxy going over 1 3/4 inches before. This didn't have any problem going up to that 2 1/4. It cured super hard. I've had other epoxies that never really cured super hard, so I was really happy with how hard it cured. It doesn't mean that another later table I do with it might have a bad result, because I've had that before where I've had a great table with one epoxy, and the next table I didn't turn out as well. But I will say I can't wait to try another table with this epoxy. I would love to hear from you guys in the comments on, first of all, what do you think of this table? And second of all, what epoxies have you guys had great experiences with, and maybe epoxies you haven't had the best experiences with? I will advise you to try to keep it pretty clean, but let me know in the comments which epoxies you've had good experiences and maybe not so good experiences with.